It's now 2:04, and it's a great pleasure to introduce Kira, who I've known for the longest time. It's been so wonderful working with you throughout these years, and so wonderful to be able to welcome you here and to tell us about all the exciting work that you've been doing. And hi, come in. So, again, thanking you for about to tell us about all the work that you've done, both on music, because of course that's where you come from, but also always having a clinical angle. And I think one of the exciting things about working with you is that you always, even though you love music and you're a great singer yourself, you always insist that music has to help for something. It has to make a difference. And I think one of the things you've shown in your work is that even though it's difficult, we all kind of feel that music is making a difference in our lives. But I think what you'll now be able to show us is that it really clinically has a relevance. And you've worked with traumatized refugees. You thought a lot about how really music can help with sleep. And so that is what I hope you'll be able to tell us about all the exciting things you found. So please, Kira, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yes, so thank you. So I am indeed going to tell you about my work on music and sleep, and also a bit about well-being in general. And there will be different interdisciplinary perspectives on this, because it is by nature like an interdisciplinary field when applying or using, having this perspective on music, so to speak. Because the use of music for healing purposes dates back to ancient times, as witnessed by this story from the Bible of the young David playing to ease the torment of King Saul by playing the harp. And even before the Bible, Pythagoras made an extensive theory about music, and actually he recommended his followers to listen to music at bedtime to calm the mind and for providing sound sleep. So this thing about using music as a sleep aid is definitely not a new thing. And this is also witnessed by the existence of the entire music genre of lullabies, where we see that parents all over the world sing to soothe their children and to calm them and to make them fall asleep. And this has been studied recently. Actually, a large study took an ethnographic approach to explore the universality and diversity of human song, and found that actually lullabies is one of the behavioral contexts where music is used in all societies, in all known societies across the globe where they had these music excerpts from, along with other purposes such as dancing and healing, and also love songs. So these were the actual universal uses of music in all societies. And interestingly, they found that the lullabies that were used, obviously these cultures had very different music cultures, but still there were some shared characteristics of the lullabies. They were generally characterized by low rhythmic complexity and low melodic complexity. So actually the similarity across societies was greater than the differences. So lullabies seem to share these musical features across all these societies. And this is also reflected in findings showing that lullabies respond with relaxation, even to culturally unfamiliar lullabies. So this was a study showing reduced heart rate with the lullabies compared to non-lullaby music tracks that were from a different behavioral category, so either love songs or healing songs. And actually babies down to the age of 2 months, you saw a difference in their physiological responses to the lullaby category compared to these other type of songs, even though all of them were unfamiliar from cultural unfamiliar setting. So this kind of hints that there are some music characteristics that are important for the soothing characteristics of music when looking at lullabies in general. But if we turn our view to the adults, we also see actually that very many people use music nowadays as a strategy to improve sleep. Because with the digitalization of music, music is now kind of available everywhere at all times. And when you ask people what they do when they have difficulty sleeping, these are the results from a Canadian population study, but it's also found in other parts of the world, similar results. But here we see that within the last year, around 25% of the general population have used music as a sleep aid if they have difficulty sleeping. And if you focus on not just the general population, but on people with insomnia disorder, so that is sleep difficulties or insomnia in the diagnostic sense, this number rises to almost 45%. So it is a very common strategy for people to use when they have sleep difficulties. So this is what we see when we look at the behavior of people and the cultural background. But then if we turn to like basic research, why would we then expect music to actually be able to influence sleep? Well, we know from basic research that music can affect arousal. And probably all of us also know it from our everyday lives that if we need to calm down and relax, we have a certain type of music that we listen to. Or if we want to go to a party or go running or something, we have another type of music that we listen to. So music can both upregulate and downregulate arousal. And this is also reflected, this is an example of a study by Stefan Kirsch with patients undergoing medical procedure, where they measured cortisol values and they found a clear reduction of cortisol value in the music group. Maybe I should use this one for the online participants also. They found a clear reduction in the cortisol value. So cortisol is a measure of stress, a stress hormone. But it was lower in the music group compared to the control group with the treatment as usual. And similarly, when looking at physiological measures of arousal, such as heart rate or heart rate variability, this is an experimental study with healthy participants showing a clear relationship between the tempo of the music, with slower music having lower response than the high tempo music. This is generally seen, these are just two examples, a recent meta-analysis of 61 studies with more than 3,000 participants all in all, found a clear effect of music for reducing these stress responses in both heart rate, blood pressure, and stress-related hormones. So it is a quite consistent effect, and that is super important to sleep, because the main theory of insomnia is a hyperarousal theory. So it states that insomnia is the result of a generally elevated arousal levels, actually not only at bedtime, but as a 24-hour condition. So if music can help reduce arousal, we'd also expect it to improve sleep. So that's one kind of like basic mechanism that we would expect to be in play. Another mechanism is the impact of music on our attention. So music can catch our attention and distract us, and it's actually a quite efficient distractor. This has been particularly studied in relation to the analgesic effects of music, so the use of music for relieving pain. This is an overview by my good colleague Cyril Juhl-Lunde that looked into the mechanisms for pain. And here you see that some of the cognitive aspects relate to attention and distraction. And this is also relevant for insomnia because, as most of us probably know, rumination and I think in English you call it racing thoughts, the inability to let go of whatever keeps your mind busy, is a core feature of insomnia. So if music can provide a positive distraction for this mental activity at bedtime, we would expect it to be able to improve sleep. So a third main mechanism is the impact of music on emotions. Because actually the ability of music to regulate emotion is one of the main reasons that people report for listening to music. So, and this has been studied intensively, and these are the results of one of the very influential studies back in 2001 by and Blood and Robert Sartori, where they did PET scans of people listening to the music that they really liked and found activation of both general limbic structures, but also, importantly, of regions involved in the reward network. So they found these very pleasurable responses to music reflected as activity in the reward network, in the neural reward network. So this was like kind of the beginning of the neuroimaging research into music and emotions. And this has recently been summarized by Stefan Kirch in a meta-analysis of studies on music and motions, where he used this ALE approach called activation likelihood estimation to summarize the results of numerous neuroimaging studies. And again, he found activity of both like classic limbic structures and also reward network regions. So from a neuroimaging perspective, it's quite clear that music can not only express emotion, but it can actually also affect our emotional state and thereby be used for emotion regulation. And this is important in relation to sleep and insomnia, because very often sleep difficulties are related to difficult emotional states such as depression or anxiety or stress. So if music can affect our emotional state, we'll also expect it to be able to improve sleep via these mechanisms. So these are some of the main arguments for why music should be able to actually facilitate better sleep. In addition, there are also a couple of extra things that could be in play. So music is an auditory stimulus, and in some cases, it may also be an important factor that music could actually mask external noise. Another factor could be the role of expectations. As we saw, there are cultural connotations to the relationship between music and sleep and lullabies. And we know from placebo research that if people expect something to be beneficial, then the chances of it being beneficial are much higher. Another mechanism could be classical conditioning, so creating a successful association between the music and the falling asleep process could also be an important factor. And then basic substitution. So listening to music at bedtime may substitute other habits that may be less beneficial for sleep. So if you have the habit of watching YouTube videos or TV or whatever, then listening to music would be something else that you do instead, and thereby facilitate sleep. So this is kind of the background of why I find it extremely interesting to look at this topic, and why from a research perspective it also makes a lot of sense. But then what about the effect? Is there actually a beneficial effect of music on sleep? So I've been looking into that in a number of ways. This is a large meta-analysis that I did recently. I updated. The first version was published back in 2015, and we recently just updated it because the first publication had 6 studies that could be included. Here we looked only at randomized control trial to use like the optimal design for looking at the effect of a given intervention. Investigating the effect of music on sleep in adults with sleep difficulties, with poor sleep. And now for this update, we found 13 studies that could be included, so quite a lot of things have happened within these last 7 years. And 10 of these could be included in a meta-analysis. And here we see a very consistent beneficial effect of the music on sleep quality. So this is a reduction in sleep difficulties, as reported in standardized questionnaires by these participants. If we are to look at the quality of these studies, this is an evaluation of the risk of bias. And here we of course see a very clear high risk of bias on performance bias, because we cannot blind participants to whether they listen to music or not. That's simply not possible. So that is kind of a risk of bias that we have to live with. When we look at the other types of bias, there are definitely quite a number of improvements from the review back in 2015, but still there is room for improvement, especially for the detection bias. So blinding of outcome assessment, that is definitely possible if you have a good research design, and also the allocation concealment. So things have improved, and there's still room for improvement. The good part of have this more studies being available is that we can start looking at some subgroup analysis also. For instance, is there a difference in the insomnia etiology? Is music more useful for some types of insomnia than others? So here we looked at, for instance, some of the studies related to age-related sleep difficulties. Some had insomnia related to medical conditions. Some had insomnia as primary condition, not related to anything else. One study looked at pregnancy-related insomnia. But overall, we saw no difference in the effect between these groups on insomnia etiology. Similarly, we also looked at the music choice. What about researcher-chosen music? In some studies, the researcher chose the music and all participants listened to the same kind of music, whereas in other studies, participants were given a choice among different playlists. But overall, we saw no difference in the effect based on the music choice. Similarly, some studies gave relaxation instructions along with the music, others didn't, and again we saw no effect. So with the current amount of studies, we don't see an effect of these factors. Then here, music seems to be kind of like an overall beneficial thing, but maybe more studies will change this. We don't know, because it's still a limited amount of data that we have available. Currently, we're just finishing another systematic review on music to improve sleep in hospitalized patients, because, as you know, sleep is essential for recovery, especially after hospitalization. But also, unfortunately, the circumstances or the environment for sleep is quite poor in hospitals due to noise, pain, medical procedures, light, the unfamiliarity of the environment. So here we were curious to see if music might be a beneficial effect or intervention in this environment. And again, we see that this is sleep quality has improved in this direction and reduced in this direction. So we see a beneficial effect of the music intervention in these 10 studies that reported this outcome. So again, that is encouraging. One of the things that I did also as part of my study, based on the first meta-analysis, we saw that many of these studies had very limited information on the nature of the sleep problems, and also very few studies had recorded objective measures of sleep. So to kind of address these issues, we did a randomized control trial ourselves, looking at the effect of music compared to audiobooks as an active control group, compared to no intervention as a passive control group. Then we measured sleep subjectively and objectively before and after a 3-week intervention period. We also did a follow-up 4 weeks after. And in this study, we included people with, or individuals with insomnia disorder. So insomnia in or fulfilling the diagnostic criteria for insomnia, which is like difficulties initiating or maintaining sleep for minimum 3 nights per week for minimum 3 months, and with associated daytime impairments. So this is much more persistent and severe compared to the more acute or transient sleep problems that we all experience from time to time. And actually in this sample, this wasn't intended, but on average in this sample, the insomnia symptoms had been present for 10 years, ranging from 1 to 30 years. So it was very persistent in this group. For the music that they listened to, we chose music with these characteristics related to the research that I mentioned earlier. Tempo is a main factor related to the arousal effect. Also stable dynamics, so that's the sound volume. It needs to be relatively stable because you know, even our ears are very sensitive organ for detecting dangerous stimuli, and their loudness is a main factor. So we don't want to activate any fear reaction, so we want to keep a stable tempo. And based on the lullaby literature, a simple structure is one of the main features there. And then we chose instrumental music to avoid the influence of lyrics or text or different associations in different people. I can just give you maybe a brief example. Let's see, maybe I need to put this one over here now. So here you hear the slow tempo, the relatively stable dynamics, the simple structure, and the instrumentality. But we also know that music preferences are highly individual. So to account for this, we wanted to give people a choice to ensure that they could actually find music that they liked. So therefore we created these 4 different playlists, so of different genres, so that people could choose. I can just give you maybe one more example, so you can hear some of the differences. So here's some of the same music characteristics, but with, again, a completely different genre and a different type of music expression. So for the results of this study...
Give some more examples.
You want to hear a few more? I can give you one more. This was a different type again. The same music characteristics, but a very different type of music, very different music expression. So this was the idea of having a balance between the objective characteristics of the music, but still giving participants a choice and giving also a type of variation that you could have your preferences included. So in this study, we did see a reduction of insomnia severity. I just need my mouse back here, maybe, if I can get it. Here it is. The blue line is the music group, and we did see a significant reduction within the music group from before to after the intervention. However, when comparing this to the 2 control groups, it only approached significance. So it seemed to alleviate to some degree the insomnia symptoms, but it was not a major effect. When we asked participants whether they experienced sleep improvement or not, significantly more in the music group said that they did compared to the 2 control groups. And very importantly, we also measured quality of life. And I really stress this because one thing about music interventions or sleep interventions is that they improve sleep. But actually, since poor sleep is related to reduced quality of life and daily functions, it is most often that when the sleep problems reach a level where they affect your daily level of function, that's when people seek help. It's not so big a problem to have poor sleep if it doesn't affect your quality of life or your daily level of function. But the moment that it starts affecting your daytime functioning, then it becomes a real problem to you. So it's important that sleep interventions improve not only sleep, but also daytime functioning and quality of life. And here we did see a significantly larger improvement in the music group compared to the 2 control groups. So I think this was an important aspect. As I said, we also measured objective measures of sleep. using polysomnography, which is a gold standard of sleep assessment, including EEG, electroencephalography, EOG, and EMG, to have like a standard sleep scoring with the different sleep stages, etc. And then we also used actigraphy, which is a wrist-worn accelerometer. So it's basically a movement parameter where there are very good algorithms to determine the sleep-wake pattern based on this. The short story is that we didn't see any changes in the objective measures of sleep. However, when we looked at the polysomnography, we actually did see a reduction in what's called sleep onset latency. So that's the amount of time it takes to fall asleep. We did see this within the music group, but not in any of the control groups. But again, when we compared this change to the change in the two control groups, the difference was not significant. So again, some kind of indication that sleep onset latency may be more or may be affected more by music, but not so clear results. And this may seem a little bit strange because when we see changes in the subjective measures, why don't we see them in the objective measures? But actually, there's a large discrepancy between subjective and objective measures of sleep, especially in people with insomnia. So it's not uncommon as such, but of course it would be interesting to understand more what is this discrepancy about. So overall, we did see that music seemed to be able to alleviate the symptoms somewhat, but it's not efficient as a standalone treatment for insomnia disorder. It may be more efficient as an early intervention, a more preventive intervention, and it may be more efficient for sleep onset insomnia. And this early intervention aspect is super important because both us and other researchers have found changes in both structural and functional connectivity with persistent insomnia. This is a study that we did comparing insomnia participants with persistent insomnia disorder to good sleeper controls, and we used probabilistic tractography to estimate the structural connectivity in the brain and network-based statistics to look at the differences. And we did find a network of reduced structural connectivity in the insomnia patients compared to the controls. And this was characterized by the insula being a main hub in this network, which can relate to the subjective feeling states, the integration of these into consciousness, and also interoceptive processes have been related to the insula, and also suggesting impaired emotion processing was the characteristics of this network of fronto-subcortical connectivity, both between frontal regions and classic limbic structures, but also between frontal regions and the basal ganglia, which has actually also been related to stress responses related to PTSD by work of this group. Another core feature of this network was that it was highly left lateralized, and we were a bit puzzled about this, and we haven't found any excellent explanations yet. But we have looked into the literature and found that actually studies on slow wave sleep, the initiation and propagation of slow wave sleep in the brain very often initiates in frontal left lateralized regions and the left insula. So if there's reduced structural connectivity of these regions, it may relate to the difficulties of insomnia patients to enter and sustain slow wave sleep. That's at least as far as we've gotten with this. So this really highlights the importance of finding good interventions for insomnia, and also to do early or more preventive interventions to prevent chronification. And with music, we've also speculated that it may be particularly relevant for vulnerable populations because there are other types of interventions. There can be pharmaceutical interventions, which are not recommended anymore as first-line treatments because of negative side effects and risk of dependence. But there is cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, which is relatively efficient, but is also a quite demanding type of intervention. So it's not if you belong to a vulnerable population, or there may be different people who are not don't have the resources to engage in this type of therapy. And this may relate, for instance, to traumatized refugees that I was working with previously, who unfortunately suffer very often from quite severe sleep problems related to the trauma. And here we did see a very clear reduction in the amount of sleep problems with the music intervention compared to the control group. So this is just one population where music could be particularly relevant. Another group that we work with is elderly persons with dementia, because very often we think about dementia as related to memory difficulties, but actually sleep problems is also a main symptom in dementia very often. And the problem is that it increases the memory problems when the sleep is disturbed. Here we had a baseline and a music intervention period, and we asked both caregivers and the participants themselves for response about the music. But of course, due to the dementia disorder or the disease, more than half of the participants were not able to provide a reliable response. But among those who did, the large majority enjoyed the music, and around half experienced sleep improvement. The same was the case when the responses from the caregivers. So obviously, music as a sleep aid is not a miracle cure. It's not something that improves sleep for everyone, but it can be useful for some. So there's also a job of disentangling then who may benefit the most. Third group that we've been working with is pregnancy-related insomnia, because very often pregnant women experience insomnia, especially in the later part of pregnancy. And historically, it's been neglected, or like it's, I don't know the right word in English, sorry. It's not gained much attention, but it actually, nowadays, you know that insomnia during pregnancy is a risk factor for developing postnatal depression or for complications during birth. So it is worth finding efficient interventions to improve sleep also during pregnancy. And here music may be a good choice because of you don't want to use medical solutions due to the fetus, and also there may be a lack of resources to engage in cognitive behavioral therapy. So music could be an easy or a very accessible solution for these women. There are very few studies on this topic. We tried to do a meta-analysis, but found only 2 studies. So therefore, we conducted our own randomized control trial, and actually we just started looking at the results last week. So I can't tell you much yet, but we're working on it, and it's super exciting. So with this, I just want to turn to the final part, which is more about the music. As I said in the beginning, there seem to be some specific characteristics about lullabies, but what about the music that adults choose to listen to for sleep improvement? This was in collaboration with my good colleagues Rebecca and Ola Adrian Hegley, who's also been affiliated with the Oxford group. What we did was that we looked at Spotify, this international streaming service, and we looked at playlists related to sleep that were used for improving sleep or used as sleep playlists. We found a large number, but we excluded some if they had too few followers because we wanted them to be relatively representative. We also excluded some if they, in the end, didn't involve music. For instance, some were learn language while you sleep, or there were also a few the best music to help your dog fall asleep. So we wanted to focus on humans, so these were excluded. A number were ambiguous based on the title alone, so we did individual assessment based on both title and comments and photo to estimate were they actually used for sleep improvement or not. And if we were in doubt, they were excluded. So in the end, we had almost 1,000 playlists, including more than 225 music tracks. And these tracks were highly variable. So there were a lot of different genres. And of course, some of the music tracks appeared more than once in these different playlists. So just to give you an impression, this is the top 20 of the most common music tracks. Exactly. So I just start with the number 2. I can give you an impression example here.
There's nothing to forgive, but I always thought you'd come back.
So as you hear, of course, there are lyrics, but other than that, you still hear the slow tempo, the relatively stable, simple.
It's hard for me to say. I'm jealous of the way you're happy without me.
So for the next example, number 3 was Billie Eilish. Let me see if I can play that for you.
I can't find my fear.
Isn't it lovely? Alone, heart made of glass, my mind of stone.
So again, we hear the slow tempo, also the relatively stable dynamic structure, and there was also a simplicity in the melody and the rhythm of this part. But then, as some of you already noticed, actually the most frequent track in this sleep music data set was Dynamite by BTS. I was hopelessly old in this context, so I didn't know them. I do now.
Sweet as honey, yeah, this beach shade like money. This go all alone, I'm into that, I'm good to go, I'm diamond, you know I glow. Hey, so let's go. 'Cause I'm in the stars tonight.
I don't know about you, but yes, so I definitely have difficulties sleeping with this piece of music, but nevertheless, a lot of people, or it was there on a lot of these playlists at this time. It should be mentioned that it was just released at this time. It's 2 years ago, a bit more maybe. So it was highly popular. So it seemed that the music that people maybe listened to already also kind of spilled over into their sleep playlists. And this also addresses the question of the relationship between the music characteristics, so the audio features of the music, and other aspects such as liking and familiarity. And we don't know the weighting of this. It's something that we're really interested to look more into, because it seems counterintuitive to sleep to this piece of music. But nevertheless, if you're highly familiar with it, it may still be very predictable to you, and predictability of the music also is a main aspect of sleep music. So that may counteract some of the non-sleepy characteristics of the music. So we did some overall analysis of the sleep music dataset, comparing it to a large dataset of general music listening at all times of the day. And we found that on average, sleep music was definitely less loud, was less energetic. It was more often acoustic, so with the acoustic sound played on acoustic instruments. It was also more often instrumental, that is without lyrics. It had lower danceability, and also it's not so clear here, but definitely from a music perspective, also a lower tempo that you can actually hear. So the average from the general music was 120 beats per minute, whereas the sleep music dataset had an average of 104 beats per minute. And that is actually an audible difference. So we found some general characteristics of sleep music that were largely as expected, based also on the lullaby literature. However, as you just heard, we also found large variability. And we did a clustering approach using k-means clustering and found 6 distinct clusters with specific music characteristics. So this visualization is related to the average sleep music. So here you see that some, for instance, cluster 6 is quite close to the average sleep music characteristics. Same for cluster 2, which is the largest cluster, except that tempo and loudness was slightly slower than the average. But we also see here cluster 3, 4, and 5 having quite different characteristics, with a much higher tempo, more loud, and also less instrumental, so more often with lyrics. And we named these, cluster 3 was radio tracks, because it was basically like mainstream pop music that you'd listen to on the radio, like the BTS song. Cluster 4 was very similar, except it was more acoustic. So that was closer to the Labyrinth song that we heard the example for before. Cluster 5 we called speechy tracks because it was characterized by a higher degree of speechiness compared to the others. So it contained a lot of hip hop, R&B, lo-fi, that type of music. So we do see that there are some general characteristics of sleep music, but also a large variability. So this is, and with some have like the expected music features, whereas other tracks do not. So this is definitely something that we're curious to look more into. And also, of course, from this data set, we do not know anything about the effect of these sleep playlists. So we don't know if people listen to them. We do know that to improve sleep, but we don't know if it had the desired effect or not. Yes, so just to sum up from here, we do find that music can improve sleep quality in various populations with sleep difficulties, even though the effect on objective sleep measures remain unclear. And music is not efficient as a standalone treatment for insomnia disorder, so the more persistent and severe type of insomnia. It may be more beneficial as a preventive measure. We are actually testing that right now, and there may be a larger effect for sleep onset insomnia. Also, we saw that music used as sleep aid is generally slower, less energetic, more acoustic and instrumental compared to general music, but there is a great variation, a large degree of variation. And I'm very happy to say that there's more research to come. I'm part of an EU project that's just been funded called the Lullabyte, where we are 10 researchers across Europe that will each have a PhD student working on this topic of music and sleep from different perspectives. So that's going to be super interesting. So just to finish, I want to broaden a little bit because we recently did this white paper on music interventions in healthcare. I'll just say a few words about that because of course it's related. Here we give like a general introduction to the building blocks of music and also to music neuroimaging research. And then we kind of map out the evidence that exists for music as an intervention within somatic disorders, psychiatric disorders, and also for general well-being. And here we use our fundament from basic research to also look into what may be the relevant intervention mechanisms for each of these disorders or conditions. And we also rate the level of evidence. So how much can we actually trust the results from this topic? It depends, of course, on how many studies are available and what is the quality of these studies. So when there are systematic reviews and meta-analysis of randomized control trials, that's considered level 1. When there are no systematic reviews, but maybe some randomized control trials, that's considered level 2, etc. So we also try to evaluate or give the reader an idea of how much can we actually trust these results. I won't go into details here because it's too large a study. I just want to say that it's really available at the Music in the Brain webpage if anyone's interested. And with this, I just want to thank all the collaborators of these projects and the organizations that have hosted them and helped along the way, and of course my colleagues at Center for Music in the Brain and the financial support that has made this possible. And thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Kira. What a fascinating and wonderful talk.
Thank you.
And it's so wonderful to see that this intuition that you have, meaning that music is important, has been borne out in the research.
Yeah.
Now, I should say, obviously, there's more work to be done, but I think, the exciting thing is being done. And I think, from my point of view, of course, the last part of that white paper, which is all about well-being, I think music offers us a unique chance to not just find things that are pleasurable, but also meaningful. And I think, that's a big thing.
Yeah.
But I think there are lots of questions as well. Anybody who, I think we'll start with Kenneth, and if you're online, maybe you could just check. If you're online, just raise your hand and we'll take you there. But Kenneth, please.
Hi, great talk. I just had a couple questions. First is, how did you evaluate the music characteristics? I assume there's some kind of automated tool given the sheer number of songs.
Yes, so Spotify, this from the Spotify project you mean? Yeah, they provide these, what we call them Spotify audio features.
Okay.
Because that's the only, unfortunately Spotify won't allow us to look into too much detail of this. So they provide this information that you can extract from each track.
Right.
But they have these compound measures that I showed you. Let me see. Yes. So unfortunately, we cannot. We only get these compound measures. So loudness is fairly straightforward. Tempo is also fairly straightforward. But for instance, like acousticness is the degree to which it sounds acoustic. But unfortunately, they will not reveal like what is this measure made from.
I see.
Yeah. So that's as good as it gets. Alternatively, you need to make a specific music information retrieval analysis, but it's kind of difficult with this large number to do. Yeah.
My second question was, you spoke briefly about how insomnia is characterized by a difficulty of getting into this low frequency state of waves in the brain. Is there any evidence to suggest that music, especially music with slower tempos, that these slower frequencies cause the brain to entrain to lower frequency waves?
That's a very good question. That's actually one of the questions that I'm addressing in the study that we're running data collection on right now. Because we know that the brain does entrain to rhythmic stimuli, be that light flashes or like a steady beat, for instance. We see enhanced activity when measuring with EEG, for instance, at the same frequency. But this has mainly been measured like with a metronome beat or relatively simple rhythmic patterns. So we do not know how large this effect is when using real music stimuli, which is of course much more complex, even though for the sleep interventions we use relatively simple music, but still. But it has been suggested as a mechanism, and therefore we're testing it right now to see, okay, does this enhancement of frequency, low frequency related to the tempo, does it occur? And could it be related in any way to kind of providing a pathway into this transition from wakefulness into sleep, which is characterized by low frequency activity? Yeah. So I'm curious to see the answer.
I think we have one online, is that right?
Brianna.
Brianna.
Hi, Kira. Great talk. I just wanted to ask specifically, in the RCT with insomnia patients, you had said that there was 4 different playlists that you used. Was there one specifically that participants wanted to hear more of, or was there one just totally against participants with insomnia? Did you categorize them in any way? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for asking. So definitely some of the playlists were more popular than others. So the most popular in this study was actually the classical playlist and this like new age like playlist that you heard. A few participants chose the jazz playlist also, but actually none chose the last playlist, which was a more ambient playlist. So there was a difference in how many choose which playlist. We also tried to explore if there was any difference in the effect, but we had too few participants to do that in a reasonable manner, and also we didn't see any differences related to the choice of playlist. And I think, so we're running a new study now where we reused some of these playlists and added a few new ones. And here the pattern is different, but also the age, average age of the participants is different. So I think that also makes a difference. So in this study that I mentioned here, the average age was around 46 years. They were between 18 and 65. In the study that we're currently running, it's again, they're between 18 and 65, but the mean age is around 30. And we do see a lot fewer who select the classical playlist and more people who select like the more ambient and minimalistic playlists. So it just emphasizes the importance of giving people a choice, but also like demographic characteristics does seem to influence this and should be taken into account. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for this. I've learned a lot. I had a question specifically relating to one of the things you mentioned at the beginning, which was not really having this control group, or now starting to look for good controls for music. And I was wondering if you considered like nature sounds. A lot of people use them when they're trying to fall asleep as a control for music because it doesn't have tempo or anything else really.
Definitely, that would make sense. In the study that I presented here, we chose audiobooks because at that time we knew that many people listened to audiobooks, so it seemed like a relevant and ecologically valid control group. Because of course, it's important to disentangle. Is there anything specific about music that facilitates sleep, or is it just the auditory stimuli at bedtime, which might as well be something different? I know of one study that looked at wave sounds or rain, but it's relatively old and they used it throughout the entire night, and they didn't have a control group. They just saw a beneficial effect of this. But it's definitely something to take into account. There's also the phenomenon, I might call it, of ASMR, which some of you may be familiar with, like people who find very specific sounds very pleasurable and also use them for sleep. So some have also suggested using this. We also considered noise, white noise, pink noise, brown noise. But still, there is some basic research showing elevated heart rates with noise, and we thought with insomnia patients, it might not be a good idea. But from a basic research perspective, it would be interesting to test also. Yeah.
And just building on one thing you said there, in your study, how long were they exposed to the music? Was it just while they were falling asleep? And do you think that maybe a full night of it would have led to maybe a more significant effect?
So what we asked participants to listen at bedtime for minimum half an hour. Then in this study that I presented here, one of the things is that was not focused on sleep initiation difficulties necessarily. So actually around half of them did not suffer from sleep initiation difficulties, but suffered from sleep maintenance difficulties. So they woke up during the night and had difficulties going back to sleep. And then we asked them, if you feel like it, you can use the music at that time point. Unfortunately, we do not have a very good assessment of how many people did that. So that's why we're trying to also disentangle this aspect of sleep onset insomnia compared to. But in our case, we recommended these 30 minutes because we know from the basic research and the physiological measures that's at least within 30 minutes you can see reduction in heart rate, respiration, these things. So that was kind of an average. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah.
When you're doing a clinical study with somebody sleeping in a scanner or hooked up to the EEG, because that's such a big break from your regular sleep routine, are there any ways that you can try and mitigate that effect when you're processing the data?
Definitely. So here we didn't have people sleeping in the lab. We measured sleep before and after, and then the intervention period they slept at home for 3 weeks with the music or without music. And this polysomnography that I mentioned, actually we did that ambulantly in collaboration with the sleep clinic because they're super good at doing these ambulant measurements. So people come in the afternoon, around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and then they get this equipment on, the EEG channels, lots of wires and stuff, and then they go home. So we have the equipment so that they can move around, and then they sleep at home in their own bed. and then they can take off the equipment this morning and hand it back to us. And that is, of course, to increase or to make it as less invasive as possible. Because if you have what you do normally, if you have people coming into the sleep lab and sleeping there, you say you need minimum 2 nights because you need a kind of habituation night, and then you can only use the data from the second night because of this intrusiveness in sense. Yeah. Yeah.
I have also 2 questions. So one, kind of building on the questions that were asked, whether you looked at how, and you also kind of mentioned you do different sounds and noises, whether you looked at maybe different kinds of sounds or music affected the depths of sleep and kind of maybe increase the deep sleep stages of that. And secondly, whether, because you also mentioned kind of music is not necessarily like a standalone not cure, but at least kind of a healing or like a remedy for that. Whether you looked at a combination of music, maybe with meditation, because even if you look back at like lullabies, it's also a lot about sort of like this hypnotic voice, and there's maybe an element of familiarity of the parent and the voice, and whether kind of meditation and kind of telling the person like to fall asleep or all of that, those elements, whether they can be beneficial as well.
Yes. Most studies so far have looked at music in itself. There are also some studies looking at like combined treatments, including music. But from a music research perspective, it becomes a little bit challenging because then we don't know what's the effect of music and what's the effect of the other factors. But it's true, based on this study that I presented here, we thought that what we're doing now is that we offer all participants like a treatment as usual, consisting of sleep hygiene advice, because that's what if you have sleep difficulties and you go to your GP, that's like the first step of what you need to try out. So sleep hygiene is like a basic set of advices of what can you do behaviorally to make the best environment for sleep and best opportunities for sound sleep. So all in this study that we're running now, all participants get this as like a basic treatment, and then we ask them to listen to music as an add-on to this. And we did the same actually with the pregnant women to see, does music add anything beneficial to this standard treatment thing? But we haven't tested it in relation to meditation and other things. And I do agree that, for instance, with lullabies, there's a lot more to lullabies than the music.
Yeah.
There's a lot of contact, familiarity, what's it called, cradling, and all these aspects, of course, I think a super important part of the lullabies as well. So that cannot be isolated to the music in itself. Yeah. We have tried, it also kind of depends on the populations, for more vulnerable populations, you need to provide more guidance and more, help in a sense with the interventions. Whereas with otherwise healthy participants with sleep problems, as the ones we're working with now, which are mainly young people with poor sleep, but otherwise like healthy and with no like medical or psychiatric disorders or anything, they are able to manage quite well, it seems, the intervention in itself. But of course, it probably could be enhanced by combining different features.
And so the first one was whether what you looked at the...
Oh yeah, that's true. Now I remember. Yes, we did. For the polysomnography, we are able to distinguish not only sleep onset latency and total sleep time, but we can also see the different sleep stages and the amount of time spent in each sleep stage. But we did not see any differences there either. And so, but we're doing these measurements again. So I'm curious to see whether this will be the case this time. And of course, as I said, there was this discrepancy between the subjective and the objective measures, but it's also important to mention that in the previous study, even though we saw some relief of the insomnia symptoms, they did not obtain good sleep quality as such. So it didn't cure them. It may alleviate the symptoms a bit, but as I said, it's not like a standalone treatment. So maybe if we see a larger effect of the intervention, it would also be reflected more clearly, because most often the responses in the objective measures of sleep are more subtle. So you need more participants and a larger effect to actually be able to see it in the objective measures. Yeah.
I'm wondering actually if music can be placed on a spectrum of self-soothing activities that humans do to calm themselves. Kind of in the extreme, there's an example of stimming for those on the autistic spectrum. They might do repetitive motions or repetitive, and I see music as something similar. So have you thought about kind of looking at your study in the context of other relaxation, from meditation to what I just mentioned?
Not particularly, but in the sense, yes, that people do, as we also saw, people do different things when they have difficulty sleeping. And obviously music is only one of them. So it's not like it's the only thing. But I do think that maybe one of the core aspects of the things that you mentioned, it could be with the autistic people and also music. It could also be relaxation, guidance, yoga, whatever. At least for music, I think the predictability and the repetitiveness, in a sense, is an important factor for this feeling of letting go or relaxing, right? So when there's so falling asleep is a transition from wakefulness into a different state of consciousness, basically. And very often people experience this as a letting go, or like a, I think that's the best word I can find right now. And of course you need to feel safe to be able to let go, right? And to close your eyes and reduce awareness of the surroundings. And anything that provides comfort and safety and predictability could help you in that process. I think these are important aspects that are not unique necessarily to music, but that could also, as you say, be provided by other types of interventions or stimuli.
Anybody more online? No? Well, I think it remains for me to thank you. Oh, hold on. One question, yes, sorry, Carl. We can hear you, Carl. Are you there?
I'm muted. Thank you very much for your talk and for your white paper. It's absolutely fascinating. I've got two questions. One is about the role of words or lyrics. Given that lullabies have lyrics typically, and the Spotify playlists have lyrics often, is there much research on the advantages or disadvantages of lyrics? And my second question has to do with, is there any research on the role of singing along with music in the initial phases of this, and then perhaps drifting off while just listening to the instrumental music or whatever, continuing on?
So relating to the lyrics, definitely, as you said, so lullabies is essentially like vocal music. So the voice provides both like melody and the rhythmic aspects, traditionally at least. And I think an important feature of that, as we also talked about earlier, is that it's not about the music in itself, it's also kind of a way that the baby experiences, okay, my mom or dad is here. So the presence of another human being and the comfort that it gives to the baby is an important aspect. And then you're right in pointing out, why is this then maybe not the case, or at least, but on the other hand, sometimes the case also with the music that adults use for sleep. It's not been systematically investigated that I know of, but some of the reports that we've had from participants or people using music habitually for sleep is that sometimes they find lyrics too engaging, like then there are associations to the text, or so maybe that's the case in some. That's the reason why people tend to use more instrumental music, is to find the right balance, that it needs to be engaging and distracting, but not too engaging, because then you cannot let go to it. So it needs an optimal balance there. And when there then are lyrics present in the music, my hypothesis would be that then it is highly familiar music. Then it's music that people have listened to a number of times already and know by heart, maybe. So therefore the lyrics are not so engaging anymore, not so catching, because they're predictable. Then that would be my hypothesis. But as I said, it's not super well investigated. Was there another question that I didn't address?
Thank you. Yes, there was a second question. It was the role of perhaps singing along with music in the initial.
Yeah, that's true. Yes, that's a very good question. Actually, I don't know of any studies that looked into this, but there is one study looking at the effect of earworms in relation to sleep music. So they had people listen to music at bedtime, and then they tested the degree to which they experienced earworms as a result of listening to this music at bedtimes. And they actually found that to be a potentially intrusive thing. It should be said, though, that they selected people who had a high tendency to experience earworms, and they also selected music with a high tendency to produce earworms. So I don't think it's completely fair to suggest that it's a general problem, but definitely it can be something to be considered, and particularly with lyrics. It would be maybe a higher risk or potential negative side effect.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Well, again, thank you for all of your wonderful insights. And